Good morning and welcome to the second Shared Waters, Shared Futures workshop, Creating a Water Sustainability Plan. My name is Kate Vasic and I lead the Climate Resilience and Water Program at the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. Thank you for deciding to spend your morning with us. We'd like to kick things off by learning a bit more about who you are. So please use the chat to share your name, your title, and your organization. And while you're entering that information, I'll share a little bit more about the workshop series and today's agenda. Shared Waters, Shared Future is a virtual workshop series designed to bring people together to address the pressing water supply issues of Northeastern Illinois. Through interactive sessions, expert presentations, and collaborative exercises, Shared Waters, Shared Future will help us all gain actionable strategies and planning tools to improve water management and efficiency. The series is hosted by CMAP in partnership with the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant, with support from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, Office of Water Resources, and we're thankful for their support. On the next slide, I want to just share how today's workshop is the second in the series of this five-part series. We held our first one in February, and we have three more planned this year happening in June, September, and November, so stay tuned for more. The first workshop explored water supply collaboration models from concept to application. We heard different examples of collaboration from regional experts and used breakout discussions to identify next steps on pathways for addressing shared challenges. The workshop recap, the recording and materials, they're all available on the Shared Waters, Shared Future website, so be sure to check it out if you missed it. I'd also like to invite you to our next event in the Century Plan Catalyst series called Great Lakes High Stakes, How We Can Steward the Great Lakes Advantage. And this is part of Chicago Water Week. CMAP is hosting this event to bring people together for conversations about how our region can work together to protect and strengthen our water systems. Through this QR code, or if you go to cmap.illinois.gov, you can register to connect with leaders from government, business, industry, philanthropy, and academia for an interactive exchange on the future of water in our region. So please join us. I'm excited today for today's workshop and for the fantastic lineup of speakers that we have who will teach us how communities can move from understanding water supply challenges to developing practical sustainability plans. We're going to start with defining what we mean by water sustainability planning and ground it in the Illinois context. Then we'll hear from three distinct case examples to demonstrate water sustainability planning in practice. Following a short break, we'll then hear from three more experts on how to integrate groundwater data, tools, and analysis into planning. And then we'll wrap up at noon or just a tad after. We're going to use Mentimeter throughout this workshop, so please go ahead and click the link that'll be in the chat or get out your phones and scan this QR code. And be sure to keep it open once you're logged in because we'll be coming back to it throughout the workshop. So I'll give everybody a little bit of time to join. And if you're having trouble joining, you can always reach out in the chat and my colleague Hader will help you. Okay. All right. So this first question, to get us started, just choose the option that best describes your primary role so we can see who's in the room. All right, we have about half of the people in the Menti. So please, continue to join if you haven't already. And so far, it looks like we have a good mix. More engineers in the room, that's good. Some water utility staff, local government staff or officials, other and nonprofit. And if you chose other, you can let us know in the chat. All right, let's move on to the next question. Um, and we just want to know why you're attending today's workshop. What do you hope to gain from attending? What are you interested to learn? Okay, great. I'm seeing a mix of understanding the challenges or, and water issues affecting the region and also trying to learn that, broaden the knowledge around water sustainability planning to help inform planning efforts. So great. This will stay open. Again, keep it open on your end. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Margaret Schneemann at the Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kate. So I'm going to be walking us through today's workshop, starting with this introductory session. So what is water sustainability planning? Put very simply, sustainability planning means planning for water use today without compromising tomorrow. And many planning processes also stipulate that we do this in a way that avoids unacceptable harm, whether it be social, economic, or environmental. Next slide, please. So we're curious to know from the group today, how familiar are you with water sustainability planning? So please go ahead and join or rejoin the Menti using either the code, the QR code here or in the chat. And again, if you are having trouble joining the Menti, please feel free to reach out in the chat and we will try to assist you. And so how familiar are you with water sustainability planning? Are you not at all familiar? Slightly familiar, moderately familiar, very familiar, or extremely familiar? Okay, so it looks like answers are coming in and we're getting a range looking like most people being slightly familiar and moderately familiar. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So the second question I have is, how confident are you that you could begin or strengthen a water sustainability planning process? Are you not at all confident, slightly confident, moderately confident? Are you very confident or extremely confident? So how confident are you that you could begin or strengthen a water sustainability planning process? Okay, it looks like we've got a pretty even spread of answers across slightly, moderately, very, and we do have one extremely. Okay, so a range of responses coming in from folks there. Okay, next slide, please. So as we move through today's workshop, I think it might be helpful to keep in mind some of the common building blocks that show up across water sustainability planning efforts. That could be ranging from understanding where water comes from to understanding infrastructure capacity and condition, to analyzing where we are now and where we might be in the future, and identifying actions to get where we might want to go. Next slide. And so I'm very pleased that we have with us today Dr. Wei Han, who's the Water Supply Program Manager in the Illinois Department of Natural Resources Office of Water Resources, where he's coordinated and overseen the state's water supply planning program for more than 4 years. His previous experience includes water pollution control permitting at the Illinois EPA and engineering consulting in the private sector as a licensed engineer. He holds a degree in water and wastewater engineering and has also conducted research and environmental assessment related to groundwater modeling. And so Wei will now share with us how water supply planning fits within the Illinois State Water Plan and current statewide priorities. As a reminder, if you have questions, please place them in the chat. We do have, as Kate mentioned, a packed agenda today. We may not have time to get to all of them, but we will do our best to get back to you, to get to them today and to get back to you after the workshop. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Wei.
Um, well, thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Kate. Good morning, everyone. My name is Wei Han, and I am a Water Supply Program Manager at Illinois DNR Office of Water Resources. Today, I'm going to share information on current Illinois State Water Plan and the IDNR Water Supply Planning Program. Next slide, please. So during the next 15 minutes, I'm going to briefly introduce the 2022 Illinois State Water Plan using water sustainability as an example. Then I'm going to present information on our water supply planning program, how the program was established and organized, what are the goals of the program, and what have been achieved so far through the program. Next slide, please. First thing first, what is a state water plan? A state water plan is a guidance for all state agencies to work and solve water-related issues from all aspects, including water quality and quantity, surface water and groundwater, drinking water criteria, public health, navigation, etc. As stated in the plan, its mission is for state agencies to develop a concise plan for addressing the water issues facing the state in an efficient and unified front. Its goal is to provide policy and program guidance in water resources management and equity. The first Illinois State Water Plan was released in 1967. The current plan, 2022. Next, please. How the plan was developed. The current plan was developed during the COVID time. Staff from state agencies met on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, which was accommodated by IDNR Office of Water Resources. As a first step of plan development, certain critical issues were identified to be addressed, such as water quantity and quality, climate change, integrated water management, and water sustainability. Many of these issues are cross-cutting, meaning that one area could have impact to the others. For example, water sustainability is primarily a water quantity issue, but water quality will definitely play a role. It will decide how useful the water is, the cost of using water, and thus the water availability. So next, please. Each of these 13 critical issues make a separate section in the plan. Water sustainability is section number 9. Concerning water sustainability, the plan states that Illinois is a water-abundant state in terms of surface water, groundwater, and Lake Michigan water. For decades, we rely on these water sources without evaluating long-term sustainability or drought vulnerability. It may take a long time to properly plan for, design, and construct an alternative water supply source or backup connections to mitigate the damage caused by water shortage. For communities who do plan for emergency and hazard mitigation and response, lack of adequate data or technical support could be an obstacle. Next, please. Like other critical issues, the plan made recommendation to tackle sustainability issue. A total of 7 recommendations were made in this section. Here are the 2 that are directly associated with a water supply planning program and our Shared Water, Shared Future workshop. One is to update statewide water demand forecast and supply yield. Another one is to establish regional water supply committees throughout the state. So next, please. So far, we talked about water sustainability. Let's ask a question here. What is water sustainability? Here, I have quoted several descriptions or definitions. State water plan state that water sustainability is all water users have the water they depend each day for generations to come. From Illinois State Water Survey, preserving water for future generations as a common goal, while the impact of the current water use may not be felt for decades or even over a century. Water resources engineering, this is a textbook. So water resources sustainability is the ability to use water in efficient quantities and quality from the local to the global scale to meet the needs of humans and ecosystems for the present and the future. So the last one is a little longer and more comprehensive because it's a textbook. Here we can see that different people may have different definition or language on water sustainability. We encourage people to think about their own definition about water sustainability. So what's your need? What's your concern? And what's your view in terms of water sustainability? Next, please. Another critical issue, as listed by the State Water Plan, is Lake Michigan water, which is associated with our water supply. We all know the Supreme Decree that limits an average amount of 3,200 cubic feet per second water from Lake Michigan used for water supply, Chicago ship and sanitary canal navigation, and stormwater runoff from the canal's drainage area. 2 things are worth mentioning here. First, this limit is the sum of 3 parts of water. That means if one part has increased its amount, the other 2 may have to reduce. So the total of the 3 may not exceed 3,200 CFS. Here is an example. We don't have control over runoff through the watershed. If during a wet year, we could have significant increase in stormwater runoff with heavy precipitation. And that increased stormwater runoff will definitely have an impact on water available to be used for water supply or channel navigation. The second thing is that this limit is about diversion. So all the water uh, were either taken from Lake Michigan or originated from Lake Michigan watershed. Uh, the water were eventually discharged or transferred into Mississippi River watershed through the canal and the river system. So hydraulically, um, this is a diversion limit, 3,200 CFS. Um, to comply with the Supreme Court decree, uh, Illinois has passed regulations and laws to manage Lake Michigan water. Uh, Administrative Code, Title 17, Part 3730, is established Lake Michigan Allocation Program. It's a permit program administered by Illinois DNR Office of Water Resources, Lake Michigan Management Section. The program prioritizes domestic and industrial water supply to navigation and other water use. So we will have a separate presentation on Lake Michigan program later in this workshop series. It will be presented by our Chicago office. Next slide, please. Um, So we have talked about critical issues and recommendations to address these issues uh, in the plan, in the state water plan. How do we implement these recommendations? So under the state water plan, there is a task force created, which is composed by a number of state agencies listed here. The task force meets on a quarterly basis, so 4 times a year. We check and update progress on recommendations and identify new issues. These are all public meetings, and all information about the plan is made available to the public through an IDNR website. So next, please. Um, Here is the progress summary from that website. We just had a task force meeting last week. The April update was not posted when this presentation was prepared. So this summary is still January 2026 update. The next task force meeting is scheduled on July 20th, 2026. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about Illinois Water Supply Planning Program. The program was established by an Illinois governor's executive order. The order identified increasing water demand and potential impact of the drought as driving forces for the program. Quantity of surface water and groundwater need to be properly assessed. The order required IDNR in coordination with Illinois State Water Survey to define a comprehensive plan program, providing draft plan for public review, establish a scientific basis and an administrative framework for plan implementation, and develop a package of financial and technical support. So it's been 20 years. The executive order was issued 2006, so it's been 20 years since the program started. Now the program is part of the state water plan, but it's started long before the current development of the state plan. Next slide, please. Under the program, the entire state is divided into 10 planning regions based on their primary water sources. This could be a watershed for surface water or an aquifer for groundwater or Lake Michigan water. Here, we are in the northeastern planning region, which is the most populated region in the state. The colored regions in the map are those who have planned at least one time or are currently working on the plan or plan implementation. Next slide, please. Strategic goals and the scope of this program. The program aims to strengthen water supply assessment and data management, improve regional water supply planning and practice, promote water conservation and water use efficiency, protect water resources and ecosystems. We would also build climate resilience and emergency preparedness. Another goal is to enhance public engagement and education on water sustainability. Next, please. The guiding principle for IDNR to run the program includes equity, science-based decision-making, regional collaboration, resilience, and transparency. Next, please. Last, I would like to mention some implementation of the program. The program has prompted water conservation and reuse, which is an essential measure during drought or water shortage time. I have checked U.S. Drought Monitor website this morning. So although Illinois is less impacted, drought conditions are stretching from coast to coast. We have heard a wide range wildfire reports in the southeastern states, and water restrictions are already in effect in many states, even before the summer begins. So it's always necessary and important to be prepared for water shortage. So far, we have 6 out of 10 regions which have planned for water supply or are currently working on the planning activities. The program has funded Illinois Water Inventory Program, which require all high-capacity water users to report water withdrawal to the program. The program has been improved under the water supply planning program. Switch water source. So City of Juliet, along with other municipalities, has decided to change their source water from local shallow aquifer to Lake Michigan. That change started from this program. The program has also supported a bathymetric survey at lakes, reservoirs, mainly in the downstate area. We have also supported a study of managed aquifer recharge. That's all I have for my presentation. Next, please. Well, I can answer questions if time allows. Otherwise, I will pass that to Margaret.
Great, thank you, Wei. So that was really helpful in grounding us how water sustainability planning is structured at the state level and also giving us an idea of some of the implementation strategies that are already underway across Illinois. So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Um, so let's go ahead and move forward. I think people can reach out to Wade directly if they do think of questions later. Next slide, please. So we just walked through several different implementation strategies, and we're interested in which of these feels most actionable to you. So as before, join the Mentimeter or rejoin the Mentimeter, either using the QR code or the link in the chat. And so the question is, which feels like the most actionable next water supply planning step to you? Is it water conservation and reuse, regional planning and coordination, improved water use data and reporting, drought preparedness planning, exploring alternative or secondary water sources, technical studies and assessments, or is there some other strategy that we haven't mentioned that you think would be a good first step? And please go ahead and put that in the chat. So I'll give it a minute for responses to come in. It looks like so far we're overwhelmingly getting regional planning and coordination as the most actionable next water sustainability planning step. I do see a question while answers are coming in. I do see a question from Edith Macra, who leads water supply planning in the region. So, Wei, if you'd like to quickly answer that while people are finishing up the Menti.
There is a website at IDNR website, a portal. You can go to IDNR Office of Water Resources. There is a special website page for state water plan with all these summaries and the implementation of the plan. It's being updated, and I think there is also a public meeting link for all the public to join the quarterly meeting, the task force quarterly meeting. So um, yeah, you can go to IDNR Office of Water Resources website. There is a specific information there.
Great, thank you, Wei. And I do think we placed a link to that website in the chat if you'd like to go there and check it out. There's a lot of material. Okay, so it looks like we got responses to the Menti regional planning and coordination still coming in at 1, and then followed by water conservation and reuse and improved water use data and reporting. Next slide, please. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our next session, water sustainability planning and practice. Next slide. So we do have 3 speakers in this session. I'm really excited about all of them. We'll be starting with Claudia Hochstein, who will share work on developing Minnesota's water supply planning framework. So Claudia is a water conservation consultant with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. She works there on water supply planning and conservation efforts across the state. And today she'll be sharing with us Minnesota's water supply planning framework and how it's being used to support local planning. Please note, again, we'll hold questions to the end, but do place them in the chat. And we'll try to get through a few after the presentation. And if not, we'll do our best to get back to you after the workshop. So with that, Claudia, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Hello. I'm like said, I'm Claudia Hochstein. And so we are in Minnesota doing things just a little bit differently than they look in Illinois. There is a statewide water plan, but it's not specifically focused on supply or sustainability. It's more of a general discussion. If we go to the next slide, I can talk about the 3 different agencies that have roles in water planning, water supply planning per se. So I'm with the Department of Natural Resources. We manage water quantity. We do water appropriations permitting, which has a water supply planning falls under that. Under our program, municipalities serving over 1,000 people have to do a water supply plan. Then that overlaps with the work of the Metropolitan Council, which I guess would be kind of the equivalent of CMAP up here in Minnesota. The Met Council plans for regional services and also has requirements for communities in the 7-county metropolitan area to have individual comprehensive plans that then must all be consistent and fit with the regional development plan. And so they approve those local comprehensive plan updates, which then include our water supply plan through the DNR. And then on the other side, there's the Department of Health who manages drinking water quality, and they are responsible for wellhead protection plans. So the three of our agencies got together and tried to do some improvements on how we could streamline the three different plans that we are all responsible for, and come out with a water supply plan that didn't capture more information than was necessary, that didn't require so much like burdensome double reporting, as communities let us know that they felt was happening. If we go to the next slide. So my agency is responsible for the local water supply plan, which is a statutory requirement. It's a pretty vague statute that more or less just states the items mentioned here. And we don't have a statewide rule that, you know, expands on any of these items, but we are meant to cover projected demand, water system adequacy, plan system improvements, existing and future sources, natural resource impacts or limitations, emergency preparedness, water conservation measures, supply and then demand reduction measures related to that supply, and then allocation priorities that are consistent with another statute, which basically says that domestic water users have the highest water priority in the state of Minnesota. So our task as the Metropolitan Council mainly and the DNR working together, Department of Health kind of, you know, they're not so much involved in the supply side of things, so we consulted with them, but mostly the Metropolitan Council and DNR worked together to figure out what we were going to do to make a water supply plan template that answers these questions that are so vague with little detail about what we're looking for, in a way that would actually meet the needs of the water suppliers throughout the state of Minnesota, and then more particularly for the 7-county metro area. Next slide, please. So this is what our water supply plan kind of used to look like. This is where we started. Word document, scanned in, sent back. Actually, this one looks like it was faxed. If we're talking like 1996 through 2007, and then an update in 2016. But we got these tables. They didn't have any sort of calculations or explanation of how to make a calculation. So across the different water suppliers, we were getting apples to oranges. And we also didn't have a way to take the data out of these kind of tables and use them to make any sort of regional comparisons. Next slide. Just another example of how our old plans looked, where there's just kind of paragraphs of text that made it kind of impossible for us to make those comparisons. There was an explanation, there were explanations of how water use was calculated, but then it was also really hard to look at that, compare whether somebody was doing it in a way that made sense or not compared to others. So one final example of an old version of our water supply plan on the next slide. So this was the attempt. Sorry, there's two more examples, but so this is just in 2016, they went to kind of a checkbox idea, where you could check something and then provide some information about that thing that you checked. And next slide. you can see that these check boxes are not a one-to-one relationship. So somebody could have, in the previous slide, told you that they were doing something related to water demand in a drought situation, but it also could have been related to loss of production. So they were just checking off items and then making statements about what they were going to do in a way that you couldn't figure out what followed. And so on this slide, you can also see that this is related to our addressing natural resource issues. So it would be checking off that something you maybe had a trout stream that was at risk from your water use, but then you would just be you could be checking off multiple risks assessed through, and then just like again, we end up in a place where we're not able to follow the logic of what happened to get to the point of how you're monitoring your goals or what you're doing. So our goal was to deal with those historical difficulties, and also being able to have the same version uh, being tracked, reviewed by the same people or by different people. I started this job here at DNR about 3 years ago and found a ton of files that just had multiple different versions of water supply plans, and it was really difficult to tell what the final version was. Um, the communities need these water supply plans in order to get drinking water revolving fund money. So I would have to try and figure out what their their final plan was and get it back to those communities. And like I mentioned before, not having uh, not having a way to use the data that comes out of the plans easily, or understand exactly what was happening within those plans, or be able to make comparisons were some of our biggest problems as a planning organization. So next slide, please. Okay, so in order to try and fix this, we interviewed our DNR staff who are reviewing plans and then using those plans for permitting water appropriations. We put out a survey, did qualitative interviews. We made several attempts to engage public water suppliers in some of this development with mixed results on how much participation we got, but we did attend sub-regional planning meetings that the Metropolitan Council had related to their water supply planning. But through that work, we defined the needs that we had, and we researched what tools would be available for us to provide a template document or a template that would let public water suppliers fill out a form that was neither too restrictive nor too vague, because we got a lot of feedback that it would be helpful for us to provide more of a framework of what could be done or not, but also that they didn't want it to be too restrictive. So that's a fine line to walk. Um, and we knew that it needed to be something that would allow us to pull information out of it. So next slide, please. We ran into a lot of roadblocks in our attempts to come up with the perfect water supply plan template tool. We tried to put everything into an Excel spreadsheet, and that was not going to work. It was really difficult to ask questions that involved a lot of qualitative information. It wasn't going to work. We tried Microsoft Forms. You can't enter tabular data into Microsoft Forms. So then we tried to use forms and a spreadsheet, and our internal system, the government arena of Microsoft Forms doesn't let external users upload files. So, we're going through thinking, are we just going to end up having a Microsoft form again? Or sorry, not a Microsoft form, a Microsoft Word document again, and have people sending that in. And we then decided to try and get our IT department to work with us on building a custom tool that would allow for input of tabular data, allow us to pre-fill it with information that we have, information, just being able to like make it as easy as possible, and like very custom, because this is a plan where we're going to have about 340 communities filling out a water supply plan over the next 3 to 5 years. And we did a lot of work to put in the build that business case, talk about what it is that we need and why, only to find out after probably about 6 months that there's no money for it, or we weren't a priority to get that money. So I love stock imagery, and this is just about how I felt at the end of that 6 months when we were told that we weren't going to be a priority for development funding. But things turn around. Next slide. A chance encounter with one of my coworkers who works in a completely different part of the Department of Natural Resources. I was just kind of complaining about how I didn't know what we were going to do. Were we going to be stuck with another another Word document? And my coworker who works in our data services area of the department said, it sounds like you could use Qualtrics survey tool for this. And I was like, well, it's not a survey. It's, we're actually asking people to submit information to us. And she said, just have a chat with our Qualtrics specialist. So I did. And next slide. We found a happy medium through this. So we can go ahead and play this little clip that's just kind of a dummy information about how we use this Qualtrics platform to get where we needed to go. You can see that there's like a pretty clear set of navigation on that side. It allows the user to move through the survey and go back and forth. But then it also gives us the opportunity to have questions with a survey logic in it, so that if you enter some information, the question comes up based on information that you asked previously. So here, you can see that if you say no to this question, you're not going to, oh, sorry, you weren't supposed to get that question about how you calculated the population served. Or yeah, sorry, the question asked if you did it based on our guidance. And by saying no, then you would have to describe how you calculated that population. But then it's going to return everything that came into this out back to us in a queryable and consistent format, so that we'll be able to make comparisons between different communities, like what their conservation goals are, what their peaking factors are, and be able to pull that information out to be able to be used for regional review, of being able to take everyone in the 7-county metro and kind of go through some scenarios for each of them. And next slide, please. So because it allows us to do uploads, oops. Yeah, it allows us to do uploads. We were able to build a what we're calling the supplemental workbooks table. So you're kind of seeing right here just the end version, or the end result of all of the other tables that go up to here. So we're using this Excel workbook to have people, or have water suppliers, establish what their capacities are, um, and answer some of those questions about like population projections, water use per capita, residential versus commercial or other water uses, that end up in this capacity versus demand information. So everywhere that's grayed out is going to return for our water suppliers calculations that are made for them, so that we're getting consistent calculations from one community to another. Next slide, please. And so like one of the big things from this is that we had previously asked communities to send us a bunch of appendices with graphs in them. And so by doing this spreadsheet, we were able to kind of pre-program the graphs for them. This allows, obviously there's nothing in here right now, but this is going to kind of make some trigger charts for the communities based on their planned treatment, current treatment, and their future maximum daily water demand. So they're going to have the opportunity to plan scenarios of like, are you going to, have kind of a best case scenario where you've been able to do some active conservation projects and really lower that maximum daily water demand, or your worst case scenario, more or less, where you're really like looking at higher water use, and is your plan source treatment capacity and storage, is that all going to meet your needs? So then we can ask questions in that form based on these graphs that are made for them. Next slide, please. So all of this is still a work in progress. We've just posted the list of all of the questions that's from that online form because we're still tweaking some of the back end of the form and how it's going to report out to us, and make sure that we're able to match up results from one community to the next. But one of the other things that we're doing is building out a SharePoint for the information to come in from the Qualtrics survey and be able to move information from spreadsheets into a common area that's going to allow us to invite our colleagues at the Metropolitan Council into our environment and be able to do a concurrent review with them, as opposed to having bottlenecks of the review process where a bunch of different things end up at Met Council and then we have to wait for them to do their reviews. This is allowing us to actually kind of take that more regional approach that we've been hoping to get to. We're still working on some of our guidance related to this and communicating with water suppliers like what expectations are and going through how to use this new tool. But we are really, really focusing on consistency and the comparability, making apples to apples comparisons across our region so that we can have an ongoing review of is there enough water in the metropolitan area for us to for everyone's plans to grow or to move at the same planned rate that they have, or are we going to have to review or return to some of these plans and, before somebody actually files for a water appropriation permit amendment, are we going to have a bigger conversation between our different water suppliers in the region to make sure that that water use is actually sustainable or not? That's the end goal of our water supply plans, is to make sure that we are meeting Minnesota's sustainability standard of ensuring that there's water available for future generations, and that our priority number one water users are not ending up being deprived of their riparian right to water. So that's a lot of information about how we built a template and decided what needed to go in it. And now it's kind of up to all of us working together at the DNR and the Met Council with our communities and the encouragement for them to also work together as they're going through these plans. And I'm going to drop the link to our water supply planning website into the chat, which is also at the bottom of this slide, but I'll put it in the chat so that you'll be able to click on it if you want to peruse any of that. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak. And as a person who grew up in the metropolitan area of Chicago, it's fun to be able to have this opportunity to present to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Claudia. That was really helpful. I'm so glad you can join us today. It's great to see how Minnesota has really approached building that robust water planning process. So I don't see any questions in the chat, but I'm actually curious to know for communities that may not have a formal planning process, which in Illinois, we don't have the kind of legal framework that you have in Minnesota. What do you think is a realistic first step that our communities or regions can take, given that based on your experience in Minnesota?
Sure. I think that really just understanding your water use is the first step, and focusing on that system profile. One of the things that might be useful is just looking at the kinds of housing that are in your community, and trying to get a sense of the water use in like a single family home area versus apartment buildings, and being able to like figure out on average in your community and also based on your future plans, like are you looking to have um, you know, denser dwelling units, or are you continuing on maybe like a large acreage or anything. Understanding the water that you're going to need for whatever your development plan is really the base unit of all of this. And I think that that's kind of the biggest first step. And then the second step is really taking a look at the regulations that you currently have, um, and whether you're able to encourage compliance with those regulations or not, and think about how you could work to get into a place where those regulations are either updated or you've got the ability to deal with them. Like if you have a watering ban, or a 2 days a week water use thing, but you have no capacity to do any kind of fines or anything, which is obviously not usually our first step on this kind of thing. But if you don't have anyone who's telling people not to do it, or explain why, then it's not a very useful regulation. So just kind of evaluating whether what's working, or what you have is working, is really important.
Great, thank you so much. And we definitely do have under our Lake Michigan conditions of permit watering ordinances in communities on Lake Michigan water. So that's a great example.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you again,
Thank you.
Claudia. And so next slide, please. So before we move to the next example, I'd like to take a quick minute just to reflect on what we just heard. So Claudia shared a lot of information about Minnesota's experience working to make water supply planning more robust. So as before, if you could join or rejoin Menti using the QR code or the link in the chat and take a minute to reflect on what is the biggest barrier to making water supply plans more useful. Do you think that its data is lacking, inconsistent, or hard to use? Is it that planning tools, templates, or data systems are inadequate? Is it limited staff capacity or time? Is it lack of coordination across agencies, departments, or communities? Is it that requirements or expectations for planning are missing or unclear? Or is there some other barrier that we haven't mentioned? And please go ahead and place that in the chat if so. Okay, so again, the question, what is the biggest barrier to making water supply plans more useful? Okay, it looks like answers are coming in. I guess not surprisingly, limited staff capacity or time is coming up as a big barrier. And then also we see requirements or expectations missing or unclear. Okay, thanks everyone. It's really great to see where those challenges are coming up for you all. And many of them do connect directly to what Claudia was describing was happening in Minnesota. Next slide, please. Okay, so our next speaker is Tom Dumm. I'm really excited that Tom's able to join us today. He's a senior technical manager with Ramble in the Arlington, Virginia office. He has over 38 years experience in regional water resources planning and water and sewer infrastructure planning for both large and small utilities. He's managed comprehensive water studies involving engineering, permitting, environmental, and financial studies, working with diverse stakeholder groups, and employing decision support techniques. He has a master's degree in water resources engineering from George Washington University and a bachelor's from Penn State. He recently served as chair of AWWA's Water Resources Sustainability Division, which oversees 5 committees: the Source Water Protection Committee, Water Reuse, Climate Change, Water Desalting, and Water Resources Planning and Management. And so today he's going to walk us through a case study focused on regional water supply planning and interconnection feasibility. As before, we'll hold questions to the end, but please go ahead and add them to the chat. And with that, welcome, Tom, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. Appreciate the opportunity to present today. As Margaret mentioned, one of the things that when she contacted me, she was interested in this project that we had worked on in Nassau County, New York City area. and it was a feasibility study directed by from the governor's office, working through the New York State Department of Health and New York State DEP. We looked at the feasibility of an interconnection between New York City and Nassau County, which is on Long Island. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the study was to address the Nassau County's reliance on vulnerability of groundwater supplies and the long-term challenges that they're facing with those groundwater supplies. And the inset at the bottom shows Nassau County. For those not familiar, New York City, Queens is on the left-hand side of that shaded area, which is Nassau County, and Sussex County on the eastern side of Long Island. And so the purpose of this study was to evaluate the technical, financial, organizational feasibility of connecting New York City's supplies to Nassau County to address those groundwater issues that they were facing. And the study was meant to inform the stakeholders on the options and constraints, not to mandate an action or commit communities to making an interconnection or taking a certain action as a result of it. It was just strictly to inform. And hopefully from this feasibility study, you can relate some of these aspects to some of the things that you're working on in terms of exploring shared infrastructure, financial and management needs in terms of organizational approaches, and then the potential for collaboration between stakeholders and utilities. Next slide, please. So the scope of the work was essentially to collect about, I think we reviewed over 30 historic reports dating back many decades, looking at water supply planning and the potential for making an interconnection. And we obtained a lot of information on GIS mapping on wells, water quality and quantity in the system. And we had a stakeholder outreach program, and we used Mentimeter, similar to what we're doing today. This was post-COVID. It was in 2022. So stakeholder engagement was really important, working with the city, the state, as well as the local utilities that were involved in the project. And we had all virtual. We did a lot of online surveys, and we use that as a means for doing our stakeholder engagement and getting people involved. The next tasks, the engineering, financial, and organizational, will be described a little bit further, so I'm not going to discuss those at this point. Next slide. So why is groundwater dependence an issue or a challenge in Nassau County? The figure at the bottom shows Long Island Sound on the left-hand side of the graphic at elevation 0, and then the Atlantic Ocean's on the right-hand side. So that's Long Island, essentially at Nassau County. And you can see the aquifers that are sourced for supply as drinking water. So Nassau County's drinking water comes from some shallow aquifers. And it's one of the few locations in the United States that has a residential and commercial population that draws water from the aquifer that they sit on for drinking water. So in Nassau County, there's 46 water suppliers, public water supplies. There's approximately 500 wells that are permitted as public water supplies for those 46 water suppliers. The average day demand in Nassau County is about 180 MGD. And what are some of the challenges that face Nassau County as a supplier? Regulated contaminants is the main one. And that includes a mixture in these aquifers of nitrates, VOCs, chloride, 1,4-dioxane, and PFAS. And 1,4-dioxane was the primary driver for this initiative. The state of New York got out ahead of the EPA and established an MCL for 1,4-dioxane, and many of the communities were identifying how they were going to deal with that. Most of them deal with it using that have provided treatment on the wells that they've identified as contaminated. They're using UV and ozone for treatment technology. The other issue that is faced by these Nassau County groundwater sources is saltwater intrusion. On the right-hand side, you see the Atlantic Ocean, and as more of the water is drawn out of those aquifers, the localities along the southern border of Nassau County that border the Atlantic Ocean have been having increased issues that have been aggravated by withdrawals with saltwater intrusion. And then finally, the safe yield of the supplies. In years past, they've had upwards of, I believe, 800 wells in Nassau County, and they're down to 500 now, just because they've been abandoning a lot of wells due to issues with contamination. So unless they treat it, in many cases, they have to abandon those wells. And that's really putting them in a situation where they have to identify whether they have adequate quantities of supply to meet their future needs. Next slide, please. So that was Nassau County. Let me give you a quick summary of New York City's water supply. So New York City gets its water from surface water reservoirs in the Catskills and the Delaware River Basin, and also in the Croton watershed. So these are well upstream of the city in relatively forested watersheds and well-protected watersheds. So New York City operates those supplies under New York State water supply withdrawal permit. Essentially, the state regulates how much water they can withdraw from those surface water supplies. So right now, as shown in this graphic on the left, in 2022, New York City was using about 1.1 billion gallons of water per day and had about a 200 million gallon per day of excess available capacity. In 2040, on the right-hand side of the figure, the water demands in New York City are projected to be about 1.33 billion gallons per day, which would essentially leave no surplus capacity for Nassau County. So one of the things that we were looking at was the opportunity to possibly do something downscaled where we didn't need to do the entire supply for New York or for Nassau County. So we were looking at some of their existing connections between New York City and the Queens area and Nassau County right along the border. And those water systems in that area in New York City had identified that they could readily supply up to 20 MGD of water without significant infrastructure improvements. So we'll talk about that in just a second. Some of the water quality challenges or concerns facing New York City was disinfection products, DBPs, moving water out into areas of Nassau County. The addition of fluoride, which turned out to be a significant issue. New York City adds fluoride. Nassau County had concerns about that. And then corrosivity associated with blending surface water supplies, which may have different pH than the groundwater supplies in terms of compliance with lead and copper issues. So next slide, please. So one of the things that we looked at was the concept of these interconnections, as I mentioned before. So we wanted to look at two bookends, so to speak. The simplest, least amount of supply that we could provide, and then the supplying the entire demand. So on the left-hand side, you'll see this, what we've termed the low bookend, which is a smaller scale option, just using the existing infrastructure and supplying about 20 MGD from Queens area over to Nassau County to the utilities that are located along the boundary of the between New York City and Nassau County. And so, as you can see in the lower left-hand figure, there, what we had there was about 4 interconnections to the local utilities in Nassau County. And those utilities could either decide to use that water themselves, or they could pass that through their system to systems that were further on the interior or the central part or eastern side of Nassau County, whatever they decided to do in terms of wheeling the water through their systems. The other option on the right-hand side was to reinforce the New York City's water system coming down from the Catskills and tap into some of the tunnels that come into New York City and provide that water into Nassau County. And that would require a pumping station and construction of a large transmission main through either the central part of Nassau County or the southern part of Nassau County. And then various utilities could tap off of that to address their needs in terms of contamination or saltwater intrusion. And in a case that if they were to abandon their groundwater supplies, we would supply up to 180 MGD for the entire county, and the cost for that would be between 1.4 and 2.2 billion dollars. And so this would be the two extremes in terms of providing connectivity between the two systems. So it discusses the range of options that are available, and obviously any option in between is also viable. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we looked at as part of this study, in addition to the infrastructure, was the financial and organizational alternatives. This summary matrix here just shows on the left-hand side some of the organizational alternatives, and then across the on the right-hand side of this graphic shows the financial review of those different options. So the options that were available were Public Utility Authority, a county special district that could be created, or just creating intermunicipal agreements. And then the fourth approach would be some combination of above, probably a phased approach where we would start out with an intermunicipal agreement and then move over to a special district or an authority at some point in time in the future as more utilities came on board. The intermunicipal agreements were best suited for those utilities that were located along the edge of the New York City system. And so those would be the ones that would be likened to that 20 MGD option, where we were just not reinforcing the infrastructure so much as just providing water. And so the intermunicipal agreements would be good for that, not so good for providing water to the central or eastern portion of the counties, the water systems over there. Next slide, please. And so to sum up, so what issues would need to be addressed to use New York City water in Nassau County? Level of interest. Identify what the quantity would be between the 20 and 180 MGD. Location and frequency of purchase. Would it be, many of the water systems said that they would like to have an emergency backup, but they didn't want to have New York City be their primary supply. And so, and then we had to identify what location where we would be providing the water. So those are some issues that they would need to determine, was the quantity, location, and frequency of purchase. That would be both Nassau County and New York City would need to address those issues. Conservation efforts, define the potential reductions in Nassau County's water use. One of the stipulations that came out of this discussion was that New York City said that Nassau County would need to get in line with their per capita water use in New York City. Nassau County's per capita water use is significantly higher than New York City's. And in fact, one of the interesting aspects that came out of this was that Nassau County's highest water use, which is about 4 times their average day, occurs at night when they're watering lawns. And so, interestingly enough, but you know, in terms of the impediment, it would be the conservation efforts would, as I mentioned, New York City requested Nassau County fall in line with what their per capita water use is if there was going to be a possibility for an agreement. We would need to make a decision about existing and new connections, whether to reactivate the existing connections. There's 4 or 5 of those connections, or whether we would add new connections and reinforce New York City system, depending on the amount of water that was being sold. And then there's the willingness and ability to sell. New York City had identified that they might not be in a position to provide water to Nassau County, depending on what their future demand projections and future water use might be. Obviously, a price would need to be negotiated in the terms and conditions of the buy-sell agreements between New York City and Nassau County. Corrosion control, as I mentioned before, blending of surface waters and groundwaters with different characteristics might create some problems with lead and copper issues. Acceptance, the willingness of Nassau County residents to receive fluoridated water was a big issue with the water systems. Disinfection byproducts, predicting the concentrations that might occur out in Nassau County, whether that would be an issue. And then the water flow in terms of defining the water delivered pressure and flow through Nassau County, laying out the infrastructure that would be needed to support either a 20 MGD or some level up to 180 MGD option. The piping and pumping characteristics and pressures would need to be identified for that flow going through Nassau County. So that's a quick summary of that project, and I hope it illustrated some of the issues and challenges that could be faced and how they would be addressed through a collaborative effort with the utilities. And as I mentioned, it was New York City and 46 water utilities in Nassau County. So next slide. Margaret?
Great. Thank you so much, Tom, for walking us through how that feasibility study really supported water supply planning and also discussions around interconnection. I think the folks listening today can definitely relate to that example. Here in Northeastern Illinois, we definitely have issues with groundwater stressed communities and looking at interconnection to Lake Michigan. So I think it's a very great example for us to hear. And I do have one question for you, which is for communities considering something similar and, thinking not only of what this case example, but also if your familiarity with other regions in our region, what do you think is a realistic first step for communities to take before launching a full feasibility study as they're grappling with some of these issues?
Well, having worked in this area for a number of decades, I think one of the first things that people dive into is looking at the engineering aspects of how we would do alignment studies for pipelines or plants and things. And I think it's really important to take stock in the governance and the financial aspects before you get too far down the road on the engineering aspects, because the governance oftentimes drives, how decisions will be made, how the finances are going to be used, what financial sources are going to be investigated in terms of grant funding or WIFIA or whatever you're using. So I would say make sure that you take a balanced approach and look at the governance and financial as at the same time that you're looking at some of the engineering feasibility aspects. In terms of first steps, the data collection and collaboration is really a good first step. If you can define what the issues are as you're starting out and what problems you're trying to address, as long as folks are in agreement on that, then it really helps to solidify like your North Star, like where we're headed. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Okay, so Tom's case really highlights that water planning feasibility studies aren't just about engineering. They really help communities think through other issues like demand, costs, partnerships, potential barriers before making the big decisions associated with engineering and infrastructure studies. So next slide, please. So with that in mind and thinking about your own context, what we're curious to know what the greatest benefit of developing a feasibility study for an interconnection or source switch is for you. Again, please go ahead and rejoin the Menti, or if you're joining for the first time, you can scan the code here or use the link that's in the chat. And when you get there, go ahead and select one option. What is the greatest benefit of developing a feasibility study of the type that we just heard from Tom, especially thinking about interconnections or source switch? Is it clarifying options and trade-offs? Is it understanding infrastructure and cost implications? Is it identifying partners and coordination needs? Is it surfacing key barriers such as governance, water quality, and public acceptance? Is it assessing demand and level of need, or is it some other benefit that we haven't listed here? And if so, please place that in the chat. Okay, so it looks like we're getting a spread of answers with understanding infrastructure and cost implications and assessing demand and level of need coming up as the top benefits. Okay, this is really helpful to see, to get an idea of how, as we think about our own region and doing our own feasibility studies, especially surrounding these interconnection source switch issues, how to support these different planning needs. So thank you all for those thoughts. Next slide, please. So next, excuse me, we'll turn to a regional case study from Central Ohio from Kathleen Smith. I'm really excited also to have Kathleen Smith here with us today. Kathleen is a licensed professional engineer, a certified project management professional, and a senior associate at Hazen and Sawyer. She has extensive experience managing engineering planning projects for municipalities and large regions, focusing on informed growth and sustainable long-term development. Kathleen brings us over 20 years of expertise to the field, and in her presentation today, Kathleen will be walking us through the Central Ohio Regional Water Study. As before, we'll hold questions to the end, but please do go ahead and put them into the chat as they come up. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Margaret. So as Margaret mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about the Central Ohio Regional Water Study, which is a study that we started in April 2024, and we had a pretty tight deadline, and we basically had all the assessment and all the modeling completed by December 2024 and completed our final presentations and documentation and rolled it out to the community in spring of 2025. So this is pretty new to the region and to Central Ohio. So go ahead, next slide. So this is the agenda of the things I'm going to be talking about. The project drivers. So why did we do this project? And then we're going to talk a little bit about the modeling and the scenarios that we were looking at. And then we developed a dashboard. And so we'll be going through that dashboard and the results. And then there's going to be a link where you all can go and look at the results, look at the presentations, and look at the dashboard as well. Okay, next. Oh, it's me again. Hi. So we can go to the next. All right. So these are our project drivers. So why did we do this project? Okay, next. So Central Ohio, if you don't know already, so especially the Columbus region is expected to have significant growth in population in major developments and data centers. So first with population, currently in the area, there's maybe about 2.5 million people looking at maybe a 15 county area, kind of just dead center of the state. Okay, so that is projected to grow by about a 500,000 or more by 2050. So in just 25 years from now, we're going to have a significant growth of population that's projected. Okay, next. And this is largely driven by major developments. So we announced Intel coming to the area. So that's the blue kind of blob on the map. So the map kind of shows major developments such as Honda, the Honda LG facility, Andrill, and the kind of the blob around each of those developments is an estimated 40-minute drive time. And so this is where we think people are going to want to live, to have a reasonable commute to go to these new major developments in the area. The darker counties kind of outline, those are the 15 counties in central Ohio, which is where a lot of the overlap of those 4 major developments that are happening or are already starting production at this point. In 2024, they were on the horizon. So that's where they're kind of focused. And so that's why these 15 counties in the center of Ohio were kind of the center of our study. Okay, next. Well, this figure doesn't have the benefit of the county outlines, but you can see kind of those dark gray those dark gray shapes, those are reservoirs, and just south of that is the Columbus area. This graphic kind of shows data centers that are in the area. And off to the east of those large reservoirs, you can see a large cluster of data centers that are new, that are coming in and that are coming online, that are projected in the central Ohio area. So not only do we have a lot of people coming in, we have a lot of large developments coming in, but we also have data centers that are coming in. And so while we have a lot of population, we also have large water users that are planning to come to the area as well. So even if it's one user, they have a higher demand. So we were wanting to track what this is going to look like through the future. Okay, next. So this is why the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency, or the Ohio EPA, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, they work together with the Ohio Water Development Authority to put this project out. We worked in coordination with the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission to study these 15 counties. And what we were tasked with was to look at the current availability of water and the demand, and then look at those future demands. We were looking for gaps. So where is there going to be a gap in water availability in the future based on those future projected demands? With knowing those gaps, we wanted to look at what are the options, I guess, for solutions. One of those that we wanted to look at was opportunities for regionalization and also opportunities for water reuse. And also kind of taking a step back, we wanted to look for what we called areas of opportunity. So where water is available, where communities would understand that water is available, so that if there's new development coming in or things like that, that is an area of opportunity where development and growth can go and sustainably use those water resources that are available. So that was the purpose of our study. Okay, next. So modeling and scenarios. So how did we do all this? So we, of course, built a number of models. And so this is kind of looking at the grand scheme of the modeling components. What we were looking at was to create an overall mass balance of the water in all of those 15 counties. starting on the left, we wanted to quantify the supply of water. So we looked at surface water supplies, reservoirs, groundwater supplies, and we followed it through the entire process. So through water treatment plants, demands, all of that kind of stuff. So in the first thing we wanted to make sure we understood were those surface water supplies. So how much water do we have in those 15 counties? Okay, next. So this is how we estimated that. So from a surface water side, we created swim models basically to estimate the amount of runoff, and we validated that with USGS meters in the area to understand and calibrate meters to understand how much water is in the system now, and then that way when we stressed stress the area with hotter, drier climates in the future, we could understand how that would change the surface water resources. From a groundwater perspective, you can kind of see the background of those 15 counties, and I guess kind of overlaid on top of that for the groundwater side are HUC 10s. So those are hydrologic unit codes, are basically watersheds that are kind of overlaid on top of that. For each of those areas, we estimated the long-term groundwater that was available, and that was based on yield, local data, based on recharge. You can see for the Central Ohio area, the west side of our area has a lot of grays and blues, and those are areas that have higher recharge availability. So the groundwater is generally more available on the western side of the area. So for each of those HUC 10s, we estimated the long-term groundwater availability, and daily that amount was available and it was used, or it was, I guess, reset for the next day. Okay, next. And then we worked with the Ohio EPA to kind of understand the capacity of the infrastructure that was currently in place, both from a water treatment standpoint and a wastewater treatment standpoint, and put those pieces into the overall mass balance model. Okay, next. And then we also looked at the water demands. So again, we have that growing population, we have the growing industry. We also made sure to include seasonal demands, such as watering golf courses, things like that. We also looked at agricultural demands, and we talked with local agricultural experts, and they had estimated in that 15 county area, the center is pretty urban, but when you get out into the periphery counties, there's a lot of agriculture in Ohio. So we wanted to understand what that agricultural demand was, and we identified that there's a potential for future irrigation, especially come 2040, driven by high temperatures that are expected to come. Okay, next. So when we had this model all put together, we basically, we were able to play with it, right? So we applied different water demand pressures, and those were based on a couple of different growth scenarios that we had. We had one that was expected, that was based on the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, which was much more aggressive population. And we also had a baseline historical growth from the Ohio Department of Development, which is basically looking at growth based on births, deaths, and migration based on the historical averages and applying that. We also looked at, as I kind of alluded to before, that overall supply of availability stress. We had a hot, dry scenario where we took global climate models, and we looked at a 5th percentile for precipitation and 95th for temperature, so hot, dry future, right? And then we also did a middle of the road, so a 50th percentile projection for precipitation temperature change. And even in that 50th percentile, the temperatures are warmer than what we had experienced in the previous 40 years. Next. So dashboard and results. So this is our dashboard, and this is, again, all live on the Ohio EPA's website. So you can click through and look at all of the information that we had gathered and what we used to make our assessments and our study. So the first tab is population. You can kind of click through and see the two different populations. Yep, that's fine. And then there's also land use on that tab. Okay, next. we can look at the demand data. So we looked at that population growth that was expected in those counties. And you can see I just picked on Licking County, a city called Newark, and we basically estimated their per capita use, and then looking at their existing service area, how that population is going to grow over time. And you can see with those two different population projections, the future demand that's expected, or maybe the range of demand that's expected in that city. Okay, next. We also looked at the industrial growth that's expected, and you can kind of see we're looking in that area where there's a number of larger developments and also a lot of data centers that are projected to come online. And you can see how between 2020 and our 2050 horizon, we're pushing basically almost a net 30 million gallons per day that's expected to be demanded on that side of the system. Next. And so on the gap identification tab, we basically have a number of nodes, different types of nodes, whether they're surface water, reservoir, groundwater, water treatment plants, and wastewater plants. And we had to define what a gap meant for each of those. And so when you look at the gap, and when you look at the dashboard, if it is a gap, it is red in the center, that particular node. And if it's a larger sized node, then that means the gap is even larger. And you can click on each of the nodes, and you can kind of see how that node or that facility is performing over time. And the how we define the gaps are defined off to the right. So for example, groundwater, if the groundwater that we estimate to be available is going to zero because of the future demands to it, then that is identified as a gap. Taking a step back, looking at that matrix of temperature, and precipitation and population, looking at all of the scenarios that we ran, you can see that there's a number of gaps that we identified in groundwater, reservoirs, surface waters, water treatment facilities, and wastewater treatment facilities. You can see a lot of those are in the infrastructure category, with the water treatment plants and the wastewater treatment plants that are going to need to be upgraded in some way. What we zeroed in on is the full speed ahead scenario for 2040, looking at that more aggressive growth, the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission growth, but a moderate temperature and precipitation stress. So not a hot and dry, but kind of the Goldilocks middle of the road. Okay, next. And what we did with that particular scenario, we looked at individual report outs for each county. And so there's presentations for each county that looks at all of the information. And then for that scenario, looks at local, regional, and potentially reuse options that utility, that county can employ for that particular gap. And so we did that for all of the gaps in shown on this figure for each of the counties. And that is all available on the website. Okay, next. And I just wanted to kind of run through a series of slides. So this is Licking County, and on the left side are a couple of green nodes, and those are kind of like the industrial nodes. And so as we go through time, you can see those grow. I also want to point your attention to the center of the spoke, those groundwater nodes. And you can see kind of all the different demands that are kind of pulling off of those dark blue demands. And so as we go through time here, we'll kind of look and see how those things change. So this is the base year, 2021. Okay, next slide. You can see that those green bubbles on the western side of the county grew. Okay, and if you click it one more, that was our 2030 scenario. So click it and go to 2040, and you can see those spokes, the center of the spokes, I guess, for those groundwater nodes, those shrunk, and that's because of the anticipated need for replacement water from the agricultural side. And again, this kind of points to the need to not only talk to utilities, north, south, east, and west of you to kind of understand those future demands. But there's other types of water users as well, including agricultural users that we need to make sure that we're including the whole community of water users in our discussions. Okay, next. And so there are a number of resources that I've alluded to on our website. So the interactive dashboard is there. There's a 15 county regional recording, as well as those individual county level recordings. And if you want to go super technical, there's technical presentations. Those don't have recordings, but there's a lot of information about our modeling techniques and what we have done, and all the data that went into our modeling and available in those presentations. And then if you have additional questions, you can always reach out to me, but there's also a water studies email address that you can also email. Okay. That's the presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kathleen. That was a fantastic look at bringing together data, modeling, and coordination to inform water supply planning. We do have a question in the chat for you, which is, how was capacity of water treatment plants and wastewater treatment plants determined?
Okay, so in the modeling, we identified the capacity of those plants based on their permitted capacity. So but we actually, so in the modeling, when we were modeling our daily information, things like that, and the demands, we actually used what was used. So if you have a 5 MGD plant and you typically produce 2.5, 2.5 is basically what we put in the model and associated with that population that you serve to get your per capita. And then as your per capita increased, then we kept, or as your population increased, we kept that same per capita until you got to the point where you needed to expand your water plant, and you hit that capacity threshold when you got up to like close to 80%, that you were delivering to your customers of that overall 5 MGD plant capacity that you have, like your rated capacity. So hopefully that makes sense. So we modeled the everyday, but the capacity was your permitted capacity. When you started bumping up to the top of that, then that's when you started turning into a gap, when you when you would be required to start thinking about expanding.
Okay, thanks for that. We have another question, which is, we'd be interested to hear any feedback that you've received on the dashboard. So who's been using it and what has been most valuable about the dashboard?
Okay, so there's I guess there's a couple of pieces of anecdotal feedback that I've received. One from a utility who kind of looked at the dashboard and looked at their future demands, and they were already in process of expanding water treatment capacity, and they were looking at the future, and they were going to have to raise rates. And they were looking at those projections, and basically it became another validation for that particular community to say, not only do we think that this demand is coming, the Central Ohio Regional Water Study thinks that this demand is coming, and we have to invest in these facilities, and therefore we need to raise rates. And that was kind of like another justification to city councils, things like that, to I guess raise rates and things like that, to pay for those investments. A couple other pieces of feedback we've gotten is, especially we've gotten a lot of feedback around agricultural demands, because I think that's kind of a new thing, especially in the water sector, that we kind of don't always think about. So we've gotten, we don't think that's enough agricultural demand. That's too much agricultural demand. So I don't know. Maybe I just feel like if there's extremes, then maybe we kind of got it just right. I don't know. I think I'm most pleased about the agricultural discussion is that we've kicked it off, right? And we're starting to have those conversations with maybe a different community than what we're used to. So those are just a couple of pieces of feedback we've gotten.
Okay, I'm going to try to sneak another question in here, which is, state health regulations are a constraint on water use that will have to be changed to facilitate this in Illinois. So we're curious to know, are Ohio regulations conducive to water reuse, or are there other statewide constraints?
So the state, kind of as we were starting up the Central Ohio Regional Water Study, they also became part of the Water Reuse Association. So the state, and I think Illinois just started a chapter as well. So that organization has really been working hand in hand with the regulatory agencies to develop a proposal for developing reuse regulations across the state. So we're getting there. But I think everyone is interested in those regulations, and we have some folks, especially affiliated with that organization, who are helping the state to kind of develop and form those recommendations.
Okay, great. I think that, thank you so much again, Kathleen. I think that's all the time we have for questions. We do have a couple more questions in the chat, which we'll try to get to either as we go along today or after the workshop. So next slide, please. So thinking about the scenario framework that Kathleen presented, we're curious to know where you all think you are today. And by you, we mean thinking about your relevant geography, whether it be your community, region, or organization. So go ahead and rejoin the Mentimeter by scanning the QR code or clicking on the link in the chat. And again, based on Kathleen's framework, where are you today? I realize you probably haven't done the type of analysis that Kathleen's done, so just your gut feeling is fine. Do you think you're experiencing intense pressure, so that high demand pressure with limited supply availability? Do you think you're at full speed ahead, so high demand pressure but strong resource availability? Do you think you're at easy does it, so lower demand pressure but limited supply availability? Or are you in a place of resource abundance with lower demand pressure, strong availability? So just your best kind of guess there. Okay, so it looks like answers are coming in. So far we're seeing intense pressure leading, but also spread with easy does it and resource abundance. And no full speed ahead so far. Okay, we got a full speed ahead. Okay, so that's really helpful to see. Just a kind of snapshot of where different folks joining today think their communities or regions are. And hopefully these examples have all given you a few ways to think about how to move forward from wherever you're starting. Before we go on break, I would like to thank all our speakers this morning, Claudia, Tom, and Kathleen. Just fantastic presentations, and we really appreciate you taking the time to share your time, expertise, and examples with us today. Next slide. We'll go ahead and take a 5-minute break just to stretch, get some coffee or water, and we'll start up again in 5 minutes. So see you in a few minutes, everybody. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hope everyone had a good break. We're going to now shift gears slightly to focus on something that underpins many planning conversations, but isn't always fully visible, which is groundwater. So in this next segment, we're going to be exploring how groundwater data, tools, and analysis can be integrated into water sustainability planning, and we'll be joined by three speakers. We'll start with Dan Whalen of Williams and Works. He'll talk about groundwater conditions and resource awareness, how they show up in planning and decision making. Then we'll hear from Dan Hadley with the Illinois State Water Survey, who will share how groundwater data and modeling in Illinois are being used to support planning and lead to tangible outcomes in our communities. And we'll close with Dave Hart from the Wisconsin Geological and Natural History Survey, who will walk us through a tool developed to help communities better understand groundwater vulnerability and using that information in planning. So our first speaker will be Dan Whalen. Dan Whalen, I'm really excited can join us today. Dan is a geological engineer who works primarily with public sector clients. His work is focused on groundwater water supply development, regional groundwater resource evaluations, and management and protection of groundwater resources for groundwater sourced community water supply systems. Dan will help us ground our discussion by covering how groundwater systems respond to pumping and what that means for sustainable management. Again, as before, we'll hold questions until the end of the presentation, but please do go ahead and place them in the chat as they come up. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Margaret. Good morning, everyone. I want to start this out with, while the title of this presentation is Integrating Groundwater Resource Awareness into Master Planning, I'm not a planner. I'm a geological engineer. I work with a lot of planners, though, and there probably isn't a day that goes by that I'm not involved or asked a groundwater-related question from a planner's perspective. And so, and on top of this, the slides that I will show are very general in nature. The nuances of groundwater systems across the country are so vast that this is a very simplistic sort of depiction of sort of the behavior of groundwater when wells are pumping and what could happen. And then I'm not really talking much about, even though some of my slides will address groundwater depletion and not to raise any flags, but whenever an aquifer is pumped for long periods of time, say years, decades, perhaps, the questions can be asked, where is the water coming from after all these? And how is this changing with time? And so there's many aquifers in this country that enter into depletion without understanding the mechanisms of groundwater or the mechanisms of groundwater flow, or actually that's what's happening. So next slide, please. Thank you. Everybody's seen this before. This is sort of the hydrologic cycle. This is really what's happening at the surface. It's a common illustration of the water cycle, but I want to just say in a most simplistic manner that this really is happening at the surface. Next slide, please. There's basically a sort of a comedy of environmental issues here, but this again is happening at the surface, and every planner knows and is aware of the environmental impacts from all these sort of bad examples of what could happen to near surface groundwater, and especially in the proximity of a pumping well. But on this next slide, please. I've got a lot of slides that I need to get through pretty quick. This is really what's happening. And again, in a very simplistic view, there's three aquifers shown here. One's near the surface. Most of the activity happening is kind of all wrapped up in that hydrologic cycle of the slide that I showed earlier. Deeper, however, and sometimes much deeper, are other aquifers that actually move very slowly, receive very little recharge, and really aren't interacting with the surface much at all. Some are, some aren't, but the deeper you go, and in this example, that deepest confined aquifer really has very little inputs and outputs, or are so regional that they're fairly hard to understand, or they're poorly understood. But these deeper aquifers are the ones that I'm kind of going to be talking more about. And so on the next slide, this is sort of a simple depiction of a water well installed within an aquifer. In this case, the screen's down in what's known as a confined aquifer. This could be bedrock, it could be sand and gravel. Most commonly here in Michigan, it's sand and gravel, though we do have bedrock aquifers. I think the state of Illinois has far more vast groundwater resources in the bedrock than we do here in Michigan. However, the concepts are the same. A confined aquifer is generally under pressure. It's not open to the atmosphere, whereas an unconfined aquifer, that which is sort of a saturated slab, lays near the surface, and its upper surface moves up and down and is open basically to atmospheric pressure, even though there may be sediments that overlie that top line. When the well is operated, the water levels around the water levels of the aquifer around the well, they slowly decline. This is commonly known as the cone of depression that develops around the well. I'm not a big fan of that word, but it at least depicts somewhat what happens is that the closer to the well, the more deeper the drawdown in the aquifer, the further away you go. It's less and less. A lot of that is dependent on the ease at which groundwater moves through the formation, and its ability to store and release water. Yeah, thank you. Generally speaking, there's three different kinds of aquifers. On the left is a confined aquifer. As I mentioned earlier, it's bound top and bottom by clay soils. The water level in that aquifer rises above the bottom of that upper clay. In the middle is unconfined, where that top level kind of can go up and down with either precipitation or just where it lies within the groundwater basin, but that top water level is not under pressure. And the third sort of most common type is what's known as a leaky aquifer, where you have a confined aquifer between clay soils, but another aquifer lays on top of that as another slab. And maybe that upper clay soil has enough sand and gravel in it. And so once a well is pumped, water can go from that upper water table aquifer down through the clay soils and into that lower sand and gravel aquifer. In Michigan, in the drift formations throughout Michigan, this is very common, that just because there's a clay soil slab overlying an aquifer, that doesn't necessarily mean that the aquifer is protected in any way. It may or may not help its ability to produce water. And so along the bottom, confined and unconfined aquifers, once you start pumping on these aquifers, the drawdown continues. It never stops unless, as I'll show in a later slide, it reaches a boundary of some sort. But the unconfined behavior is a little characteristic hump. Sometimes you'll see that, sometimes you don't. But nevertheless, at late pumping times, the water level just keeps on decreasing. And a leaky system where you have a clear source aquifer that lies above a leaky clay, this type of formation can not always will pump for a while and then the drawdown will slow or sometimes stop, and it's commonly referred to as like an aquifer that's reached a stable condition. That may or may not be true. This same situation arises when the propagating drawdowns moving away from the pumping well hit, say, a river or some kind of a lake or some kind of a recharge boundary that would cause this drawdown to stop at late time. So on the next slide, this is sort of another, again, these are all very simplistic pictures, but on the top view, this is sort of a natural groundwater situation. The well is there, but it's not pumping. Groundwater flow is moving from the left and from the right and converging onto a stream somewhere. And the dashed line along the top is sort of the groundwater elevation, whether it's a confined aquifer elevation or it's the top of the water table. Once the well starts pumping, a little so-called cone of depression develops. That at that stage, water is being removed from storage, and that cone will develop deeper and deeper the longer that well is pumped, until maybe at some point in this bottom picture, the expanding drawdowns reach in most cases, it's a stream, and water then the water pumped from the well actually is in part coming from this stream. So there's a groundwater discharge capture happening in this bottom image. Once the well turns off, it would return maybe to this middle figure where now the cone of depression starts to relax, and maybe back to the top image where it returns to its pre-pumping state. In some cases, however, maybe that top line doesn't come all the way back, and which would indicate some either short-term or long-term removal of storage from within the aquifer. Next slide, please. So under natural conditions, there's no wells in the area. Aquifers are in some kind of a pseudo steady state, sort of a, kind of like an equilibrium state. Once you add a well, you're superimposing a new discharge on this, and it's got to be balanced in some way by either just taking storage out of the aquifer, either the drawdowns reach some natural discharge or some increase in recharge, which I think I would argue would be probably the least, or some combination of all three. Next slide, please. The only way you can know this is if you map the groundwater, the boundaries of the aquifer. You perform what's known as aquifer tests so you can understand the hydraulics of how an aquifer behaves. And sort of in the words of the late John Bredehoeft, the water budget has almost no use in determining the magnitude of the sustainable groundwater development. That doesn't depend necessarily on discharge, but basically on how much natural discharge can be captured. Next slide, please. The well, I don't like reading from slides, but for lack of better ways, the maximum quantity of groundwater is limited by the deleterious side effects caused by pumping and operation within the basin. And in other words, what can be tolerated, or which would be driven by economics or otherwise. So some aquifers can be sipped on, and you maybe you wouldn't know, but other aquifers get quite intense development, and it's that balance point that I think communities or water using regions need to determine what can we tolerate as a maximum amount of withdrawal or storage removal. And the next slide. Okay, and then this is just sort of to sum it all up, is really there is no real safe yield. I think it's probably better characterized as a practical sustained yield. And that is basically the yield that doesn't lower groundwater levels to some irreversible critical level, where you've captured natural groundwater recharge and now you're reducing it to a point where, say, maybe the biology of that setting is being affected. Certainly, other undesirable changes might be either water quality or perhaps, in an extreme case, maybe loss of vegetation, maybe from the transpiring plants, that so-called phreatophyte type trees. Next slide, please. Here's just a simple depiction of the dashed lines are the groundwater flow lines. The solid lines are the water. In this case, it says water table contours, but it could be a confined aquifer. There's a stream running through there. You can see how the contours of the water table bend upward, indicating that this groundwater is discharging to the stream, and here is a water well pumping, causing an overprint of its own contours, so that once that well is pumping, these are what those contours might look like in this simple depiction. But this simple depiction is also showing that the gradient at the stream is changing, and so there is some capture of this natural natural groundwater discharge, which is the stream. Next slide, please. Here is a very real situation, while not nothing to be alarmed with, potentially on the edge of depletion. But here's 4 wells pumping near a stream in a sort of a isolated groundwater basin. These darker contours are the groundwater contours. It's a semi-confined aquifer. Most of the aquifer lies as a slab between a lower and an upper clay, and then tends to daylight all along the lower reaches of this little kind of meandering stream down there. And that, back into the planning world, no planning would be complete without some kind of wellhead protection area delineation, say where you can determine where the groundwater is coming from. And so on the next slide, these are the flow lines that come into those wells when this well field is pumping at max day, say. The length of these lines are 10 years. This is kind of typically how Michigan does it. But in some ways, it kind of shows a bit of a surprise where one, myself included, might assume that most of these flow lines come from straight up in the basin, say to the northwest, where the majority of these flow lines are shown. But a surprise to this analysis, we found that actually groundwater was coming out of the south, and a lot of that had to do with just the behavior of groundwater on both sides of this stream. So when you do the next slide, please, when you outline those flow lines, this is what this well field's wellhead protection area delineation is. And so from a planner's point of view, these are the areas that in theory you'd want to protect, or these would be the most important groundwater areas to try to invoke some type of land use planning, if that's even possible. But okay, so here's a case study. I don't have a lot on Ottawa County, and maybe may or may not know something about this, but Ottawa County has a lot of private, some public, but many irrigation wells. And this is sort of uh, an actual showing the reduction in the static water levels, mostly from the center part of the county, from 2020 to 2025. In a matter of about 5 years, groundwater levels have dropped. Here's a case where there's 2 aquifers. There's a shallow aquifer, highly used by a mostly private and some irrigation users, and a deeper bedrock aquifer that coincidentally is the majority of this deeper bedrock aquifer is discharging right to the northwest of this county into Lake Michigan. So this being one of the major discharge zones of Michigan, and Ottawa County is at the epicenter of that. And so under today's or the last 5 years growth patterns, it is predicted that in 2036, say, the continued lowering of the static water levels in these 2 formations will continue. And a side thought to this is this particular bedrock formation, the Marshall Formation, it's stratified. And so you can't, in certain areas of Michigan, get too deep into this bedrock because the water quality worsens in the form of higher salinity. So concurrently with the regional water level lowering of this aquifer, it's also increasing in salinity at the same time due to upwelling of these so-called salty waters. Next slide, please. Here's another example. Allegan County sits right below Ottawa County, right at the right about where the base of if you see through the mitten, right about the base knuckle of the mitten there on the left side, that's where the two counties are, and that's where this groundwater discharge is. But a lot of the Michigan population, I'll say this real quick to move on to the next slide. There's a lot of kind of growth going from east to west, and they're coincidentally landing in Ottawa, Van Buren, even in Kent County, and that's where my office is right now. The three green counties on the lower left. So between the year 2000 and the year 2020 in Allegan County, you can you can visually see these are all every dot is either a private water well or an irrigation well or a water supply well for a small community. You can visually see the intensity of growth that's occurring there. And so with growth, next slide, please. With growth, more users, more water use. And so the concern here from a planning perspective, and this is in the very early stages. I couldn't tell you how much planning's being done, but here's a case where you can see population is growing and water use is growing, and the only water available is groundwater. And so there's a small concern at this point in time that perhaps this could end up in the same situation as Ottawa County, where I wouldn't say that people weren't paying attention to this, but with growth comes greater water use, and if there's no other water to use but groundwater, then this is how these type of I don't want to use the word depletion, but this is how these groundwater resources can be reduced somewhat. And to sum the Allegan County, it's pretty complex. Everything geologically in Michigan is complex. We have a huge thick slab of glacial drift that lays on top of the bedrock. And there's only really one or two bedrock formations that are usable in Michigan. All the other ones either don't give up any water or they're too salty by the time you get down there, if there's groundwater in them. But Allegan County is no exception. There's certain areas where there's a seemingly ton of available resources, and then there's other areas where it's difficult to even make a simple house well. And as luck would have it, there's a lot of growth in those areas, which don't necessarily have a lot of groundwater resources. And as with a lot of places around the country, there's sites of groundwater contamination, so we're always on the lookout for that. While certain aquifers are being heavily utilized, if you will, and so there's always that to look forward to. So those things came out of this study as well. And while there isn't as much of a long-term water level record as there was for Ottawa County. It's a scattergram mostly, so it's really difficult to say if they're heading into a declining groundwater level situation. But the bottom line is they need to watch this closely and consistently. And next slide, please. So a bunch of workshops were held. We tried to get as many local agencies, local governmental units together. And any of the decisions that were made, any decisions that get made need to be driven by the data that's collected. And today, it's just the early stages of data collection, but those strategies, policies, and programs really are all dependent on what the data is saying. And so presumably those would, if you were in a declining groundwater situation, that those strategies, policies, and programs would reflect those areas that are experiencing groundwater declines. And then I don't think anything's been determined about the level of call to action with some of these local units of government. Frankly, in a lot of cases, especially in Michigan, where most people think you drill a well, you get water, and there's plenty of water everywhere, it may or may not be the case. But if there's nothing signaling danger, not many communities really want to get involved in any kind of, activity. And so I think in the meantime, I think the best way to at least to continue that awareness is to just build the relationships between the communities, and especially within those communities where you got your sort of growth hotspots developing. And I think I'm ahead, but a lot of communities don't typically think of groundwater as a manageable resource or a resource that they need to manage. And I'm here to say groundwater is a resource that communities can manage, and especially if they're watching it, or especially these groundwater sourced community water supply systems really need to understand their local groundwater resource by performing aquifer testing, mapping, and just constant data collection. And so once you understand the conditions of groundwater in your area, there's a lot that you can react to, or at least you've got a basis from which to make decisions, whatever they may be. And I'll say this again, there are so many people in Michigan that truly believe Michigan is just full of water and we don't have a water problem. And while generally that may be true, there are other areas in particular that it's not true. And not to get too much wrapped into geology, if you go over to the thumb of Michigan, it's probably one of the worst places for groundwater is over in the thumb area, or southeast Michigan is particularly poor. But all of this can be documented in a master plan. Um, and everything is based on building relationships between communities and public education. And that is all I have to say this morning.
Thank you, Dan. That's a great, fantastic presentation. I think it's extremely valuable to hear how groundwater, not only the mechanics of how groundwater systems respond to pumping and all the vocabulary and terminology, but also how local data, preferences, and conditions matter so much for planning. I do think you answered the first question I had for you, which was, in the case of declining groundwater levels, what typically can trigger action to happen at the local level? Think I think you did a pretty good job of answering that already, but do you have anything to add?
Now, other than the only way you know that is to stay on top of data collection, just a local understanding of the local groundwater resource. And all I can say on top of that is Michigan's kind of unique with, the Illinois versus Michigan on groundwater use is somewhat different. They're really the center of the state, say the Lansing area, is probably the heaviest concentrated groundwater withdrawals. But all these small communities really are kind of little blips on a map. And so it's not as large concentrated areas as, say, the state of Illinois has.
Okay. Um, so I started the presentation, or we started the presentation thinking about the definition of water sustainability planning, and I did mention that part of what planners can add to that is avoiding unacceptable impacts as we're trying to achieve sustainability. And you mentioned what can be tolerated. And so a question I have for you is, how can communities start to identify what can be tolerated or unacceptable impacts and what that looks like in their own communities?
Oh, that's a huge question. It is. Um, maybe on the extreme side of that, one answer, sort of the extreme side of that, might be that what if we're pumping groundwater so much that we've started to deplete stream flow? or maybe there's a loss of vegetation. And maybe that's kind of when it's time to panic, and you haven't really reached a point yet, but um, the only way you can know that is by some pretty rigorous mapping and some pretty rigorous testing to understand the hydraulics of the formation that you might be asking about. And That's kind of a non-answer, I know, because it's a lot of it's just got to be the trend. And in the case of Ottawa County, they're looking at 15 years of static water levels, and it's pretty obvious we have a problem. But where does it become? That's what's your question, right? Is it's like when is it really a problem? And I would say probably when you can see a trend, then it's becoming a problem.
Okay. So thank you again, Dan. That was an incredibly
Thank you.
valuable presentation. So next up, we are going to, next slide, please. Next up, we are going to hear from another Dan Hadley. Dan Hadley is an associate research scientist at the University of Illinois State Water Survey. He works on groundwater flow modeling and groundwater monitoring projects throughout Illinois to support long-term water supply planning for communities and aquifer sustainability. He earned his master's degree in geology at Northern Arizona University, has worked at the State Illinois Water Survey since 2014, and he's currently working on his PhD at the University of Illinois. And so today he'll share his work from Kane County that uses groundwater modeling and local data to better understand supply, demand, and water quality in shallow aquifers and what that means for planning and management. As before, please place any questions in the chat. And with that, Dan, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Great. All right, so thank you. My fan going on in the background. Yeah, thank you, Dan. That was a really great primer in terms of discussing how the mechanics of aquifers and also how we think about sustainability of aquifers. And so I wanted to highlight today a study that I have been working on with Kane County in Northeast Illinois for the last several years. We are looking at shallow groundwater sustainability in that county, and I wanted to emphasize how we work with communities to gather their data and how that informed our groundwater flow models. Next slide. So Kane County is in Northeast Illinois. It's part of the Chicago metropolitan area, and many of the communities within King County are somewhat or entirely reliant on a deep sandstone aquifer that we refer to as the St. Peter or the Ironton Galesville. The map on the right just shows what the current water levels are in the St. Peter sandstone. You'll notice that there's a lot of blue and there's a lot of red. And in red is where the water levels are very low. And so at this point, in areas sort of outside of King County, it's below sea level. And in historic times, it's been near land surface or slightly below land surface. So there's been a lot of long-term water level decline in that system. And so there may be situations where communities may have to switch from the deep sandstone system to using shallow groundwater resources. So Kane County wanted to be very proactive in determining what the groundwater availability is for the shallow system if that situation were to occur. But there's some challenges though with using the shallow aquifer system in Kane County, in that there is high levels of chloride in certain areas as a result of road salt. There's naturally occurring arsenic in some of the sand and gravels that homeowners have to deal with. And there's also the emerging issues of PFAS, which has been measured in several municipal wells within King County that are open to the shallow aquifers. So, but they're very important. The aquifers are relied upon by many, many thousands of homeowners in the county, also by municipalities. And as Dan illustrated very nicely, the shallow aquifers provide base flow to streams within King County. So we're going to see what has happened in terms of base flow decline as a result of pumpage. Just a little background. I'm going to talk about the shallow aquifer system as a whole, but really it's two components. It's the upper sand and gravel layers, and then it's the underlying shallow bedrock aquifer. So um, prior to all the glaciers coming in, the upper bedrock surface was eroded, and there was channels carved in there. We call those bedrock valleys. And within those bedrock valleys, that's where a lot of highly productive sand and gravels were laid down by the glaciers and outwash streams. And so today those are used as very productive aquifers. And so the shallow aquifer system is the upper sand and gravels, and then sort of the upper 25 to 125 feet of the bedrock surface where it's been weathered, and we refer to that as the shallow bedrock aquifer. Next slide. So the Kane County has a long history of thinking about water resources and groundwater sustainability. And in the early 2000s, the Illinois State Water Survey made a very large, they completed a very large modeling study where we developed a deep aquifer model, a shallow aquifer model, and the goal of this current study was to revisit that and to update the last 20 years of water use in that model. And then we also wanted to add a component of transport chloride to see how chloride has built up in the aquifer through time and what it's going to be in the future, because that's increasingly becoming a concern for municipalities to deal with. So, as a part of this study, we formed a Kane County Groundwater Sustainability Group. And so this consisted of um, water operators and public works directors for every municipality in Kane County that partially uses or wholly uses shallow aquifers. And the main goal was to meet with them, discuss their issues that they're having, if any, collect any water level data that we did not already have, QA/QC their water use and their water level data. And one of the other main goals was to take the projections that have been developed for all these communities by CMAP out to 2050, and then make any kind of modifications to those based on um, the actual on the ground plans as far as whether community is going to um, add a well, take out a well in production, and we could put all that in our groundwater flow model and run that out into the future. The other main goal was to just gather a lot of chloride data so that we could calibrate our chloride transport model to that. Um, and the output of that study was to come up with what is the sustainable supply of groundwater in each subwatershed within the county versus what's being used today and what's going to be projected to be used in out to 2050. And then to also simulate how chloride has accumulated in the shallow aquifer system through time. I just finished the report. I actually published it a few days ago. So there's the cover of it, and then there's the link to that, which maybe Hader can put in the chat. So you could take a look at this report, and all the figures are going to be from that report. So next slide. Okay, this is a map of where shallow demands currently are within the county. So in yellow, all those yellow dots are withdrawals out of the sand and gravel system, and the red dots are withdrawals out of the shallow bedrock system. There's more shallow bedrock wells, but there's actually more use out of the sand and gravel system because that's the more productive part of the shallow aquifer system. And most of the groundwater withdrawals are within the Mid-Fox River watershed and also in the Mill Creek watershed, and to a lesser extent, the Blackberry Creek subwatershed. That's where all the communities are located along that Fox River corridor, so that's not surprising to see. Um, I'll note that in 2003, starting in 2003, there were several communities within the Mid-Fox River watershed that use less shallow groundwater in favor for more sandstone water and in favor for more Fox River water due to some of those water quality issues that I had mentioned before. And the demands are expected to increase as a whole by a little under 5% out to 2050, which is not too different than what the initial CMAP projections are. But we did have a lot of differences amongst, individual communities, but collectively, we're pretty close to what CMAP projected. Next slide. So we took our groundwater flow model and we calculated the sustainable supply for each of those subwatersheds. And we did this by calibrating to pre-development base flow, or our best understanding of that in all of these creeks. And then we figured out how much groundwater can you actually extract out of these subwatersheds where you would not exceed a 15% reduction in base flow to those creeks. So in other words, how much groundwater can we withdraw where we maintain an 85% level of base flow? So we did this for each of these subwatersheds, and that this table just shows what those numbers are. And so overall, within all these subwatersheds within the county, you could sustainably withdraw about 15 million gallons per day. Uh, Currently in 2025, communities are extracting a little bit over that, so 16 million gallons per day. Um, the ones that are highlighted in red, the Mid-Fox River, Mill Creek, and Blackberry Creek, those are the main watersheds that are exceeding that sustainable supply and will exceed that sustainable supply in 2050. And also, we did another scenario in our model where we increased everyone's demands by 30% out to 2050 as a sort of hypothetical scenario, like if everyone starts putting in data centers or some other industry comes in. Um, Next slide. So as Dan mentioned earlier, when you exceed your sustainable supply and you have groundwater withdrawals near creeks, you could actually have a capture of that stream flow. And so in particular, like in Mill Creek, where there's a very large disparity between sustainable supply and demand, we've had a 43% decline in natural base flow from the mid 1960s to now, and also a 13% decline in the South Branch Kishwaukee to the north, and also a decline in the Mid-Fox River subwatershed. Next slide. So we could plot these through time, and so the little dashed lines in each of those graphs is what we think of as the pre-development base flow. We want our model to be close to that starting out. And then you could see in those four subwatersheds that through time, the flow to those creeks has gone down and will continue to go down because there's continued demands out to 2050. Next slide. Uh, However, we have to talk about the significance of effluent, though, because many of these subwatersheds also have effluent being added back into them. So, for example, like in the Mid-Fox River subwatershed, um, we estimate that there's a sustainable supply of 6 million gallons per day. In 2025, there's 9 million gallons per day being withdrawn. But within that within that watershed, there's 70 million gallons per day of effluent being added into it. So any kind of decline in base flow as a result of groundwater extraction is just completely dwarfed by all the effluent that is put into that watershed. So when we think about sustainability, you have to take in the context of effluent that's being added back in Because if I were to ignore that, you would think, whoa, there's going to be no water in the Mid-Fox River because of this. But in reality, there's a lot of water within that river. Um, the other two creeks that I want to highlight were Mill Creek and Blackberry Creek. Those creeks do not receive a lot of effluent, or they don't receive any effluent. And so demands in 2050 are definitely exceeding sustainable supply. Um, in the case of Mill Creek, some of that is being offset by a half an MGD of effluent being added back in. And so that effluent has alleviated the decline in base flow, but still in summer drought conditions, Mill Creek is dry or nearly dry, um, and even with those effluent additions. So uh, the main takeaway is that sustainable supplies and demands are not evenly distributed amongst the subwatersheds. And that Mill Creek, Blackberry Creek, and South Branch Kishwaukee are in deficit now and will be going into the future. Next slide. The other component of this is the simulation of chloride in the shallow aquifer system. So we took our model and applied chloride to it through time and calibrated our model to all of the chloride data that was sent to us by all these different communities within the sustainability group. And the plot to the left shows chloride levels in layer 13 of our model, which is the main sand and gravel aquifer within the county. And you can see that there's many areas that are white where there's no chloride. And then you can see lots of areas that are ranging from orange to purple. So those values range from 15 milligrams per liter to past 500 milligrams per liter. And I'll note that the 250 milligram per liter threshold is the secondary MCL. So after 250 milligrams per liter, that's when communities really have to start thinking about how to deal with chloride and how they whether they're going to start treating it. Because past that, the chloride starts becoming a corrosivity issue as far as treatment plants are concerned. And it's also a concern from homeowners to have high chloride in their wells too. So you'll notice that most of the chloride is concentrated along the Fox River, Mill Creek, and Blackberry Creek areas. And if we project that out into the future as just a business as usual road salt application approach, it's only going to get worse. Next slide. Okay, so we can run simulations and test different things. So the communities wanted to know if we were to adopt sensible salting practices across the county and reduce road salt application by 40%, what would that look like? And you could see if you compare what it is in 2025 and 2050, there's not that much difference between those maps. So the main takeaway is that chloride keeps increasing, and if you adopt sensible salting strategies now across the county, that will not necessarily reverse those trends, but will keep things pretty much level out to 2050. Next slide. We could also run a scenario where we just entirely stop road salting and see where chloride levels are out to 2050. And that's what this map on the right shows. So if you compare what is in 2025 to this scenario, you could see that there's substantial reductions in chloride in the shallow aquifer system, but it's still there. It's still present. So we were curious, well, how long would it take for chloride to actually leave the system if we were to stop road salting today? So next slide. So we ran the model out for another couple hundred years, out to the year 2250. And there's still chloride present. And so what we did was we converted that to a years or the amount of time it would take to reach background chloride levels, which is less than 15 milligrams per liter. And so this map, the map on the right shows if we were to stop salting today, how long would it take for that chloride to exit the aquifer system? Um, and you'll see that it ranges from less than 25 years in some areas to some areas take more than 200 years for that chloride to actually get flushed out of the system. Next slide. So I just want to zoom in here. This is the Geneva well field along Mill Creek and near the Fox River. Um, and I wanted to highlight this particular area because Geneva has some of the highest measured chloride levels in their municipal wells. In one of their wells, it's over 400 milligrams per liter. And so some of their wells are closer to Mill Creek and in a pretty highly transmissive area of the aquifer. So if they were to really adopt sensible salting strategies and all the surrounding areas were to adopt sensible salting strategies, the chloride could get flushed from that system for, within a few decades. But as you go further to the north, those two wells um, are the St. Charles wells, and those would take much longer to get flushed out of the system. And so we really wanted to do this, to run this simulation so that it gives an idea for communities of what is the benefit for sensible salting, how long will it take for those results to manifest, and to also highlight like if you're going to have to rely on your shallow aquifer system as a result of, maybe the sandstone aquifer is depleted and more communities are going to have to rely on the shallow aquifer system, what is that going to look like for you in terms of having to deal with chloride levels? Um, and there are certain areas that it takes, well over 200 years for chloride to leave the system. So those would be areas that you'd want to target if that's if that's a highly productive area that you want to extract water from and rely upon that you should be aware of that. Next slide. So the main takeaway is that sensible salting practices that target both roads and commercial areas are ideal. Chloride can have tens to hundreds of years of residence time, and it really depends on the proximity to rivers and how transmissive the aquifer is. So, going back to the idea that Dan discussed, is that you really have to know the hydrogeology of your aquifers to understand um, how to manage them sustainably. And my main takeaway is that this is all the more reason to start sensibly salting now and adopting those practices now because it's going to take a long time for those benefits to manifest. Um, and with that, I'd be happy to take any questions if I have time.
Thanks, Dan. That was really helpful to see how all that data and monitoring comes together. We do not have time for questions, but if you could hop in the chat, you do have a bunch of them waiting for you there. But in the interest of time, if you could take those in the chat, that would be
Yep.
great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. So our next speaker is Dave Hart. I'm really excited that Dave Hart is here today. Dave Hart is a hydrogeologist and geophysicist with the Wisconsin Geological and Natural History Survey. And so, Dave, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thanks, Margaret. Yeah, so today I'm going to have two topics. The first is data, kind of basic data that Dan Whalen mentioned earlier that we kind of need to understand sustainability with our aquifers. And then the second is an online app that we created to help communicate some ideas about the aquifer system. I'm not saying you would want to do the app exactly like we did, but I think the counties our study area found it really useful. Pictured there is Trey Curry. Trey is the one who wrote most of the app for us, and he's collecting some water quality data in a central sand stream. Next slide. So in central Wisconsin, the area outlined by the red circle, there's a lot of agriculture and we have high nitrate. Many of the wells are over the 10 milligrams per liter health standard. And so this study was funded to try to help understand and manage that system, think about how we might do better with it. Next slide. Here again, we've zoomed into the system. We're approximately where that oval was previously. Yellow on this map is agriculture. Green, all the greens are forested areas. Browns are grassland, and you can see some towns and villages shown in red. And there's some wetlands as well shown in the blue. So it's primarily agriculture. So the data that we wanted to collect is we thought, let's get some baseline, let's get a synoptic survey regionally of nitrate in the system. And what we thought we'd do is we'd look at places where roads cross streams, and because there's no infrastructure we need, no wells to drill, there's no infrastructure. It's scalable. We're going to get an integrated area for our data. That works if you're in a place where things are mostly sandy and things are base flow dominated. And that integration also means you're not getting point data, you're kind of averaging things out as well too. So this is what we did, is the next slide. And so we looked at places where things are intersecting in central Wisconsin, where roads intersect streams, and there's 1,400 possible monitoring points, shown by the orange dots there. It's a wide variety that we might choose from. Next slide. And here's the data. Over the course of a couple months, the 250 hours of field works, they got 513 road crossing measurements, and those are shown as the dots across the central sands. You can see the scale there. Red is over 16 milligrams per liter. Green is dark green's under 2, and you can see the range. You can see kind of the agricultural area shown there in the air photo. You can see the farm fields. A lot of this is center pivot and kind of intensive ag. And so you can, your eye right there kind of picks that there's probably a correlation. Next slide. And so what we did is we combined that data with a ModFlow model that was created for the entire region. And this model was also created to provide boundary conditions for some inset models looking at climate change on climate effects, pumping effects on lakes in the central sands as well too. But so we put a particle in every cell on the water table in this model, and we looked at where we have the particle tracking. We use ModPath to say the particle starts here and it's going to track its way, and where does it discharge and how long does it take to discharge. And you can see those transit times. The dark blue is under 2 years and the yellow is over 50 years. And so you can see there's a wide range of transit times in this model. That's important if you're trying to see a change in water chemistry, or trying to, as we saw in Dan's previous slide, these things don't happen overnight, and we need a way to communicate that to our audience, to our constituents, to the people who need to use the model. Next slide. And here we're zooming into an individual monitoring point. You can see all of the flow lines there. You can see they start perhaps in yellow, and we can follow the track of the flow line to where it discharges, and those blue squares are the model representation of streams. And we can see that there's a range. Most flow paths take on the order of a decade or two. Some are taking longer, some are taking just a series of years. You can see that many of these flow paths are starting in yellow. That's agriculture. Some are starting in green, some other places. Let's go to the next slide and look at that. So we know we have a model of where the groundwater recharges and where it discharges. And so if we look at that same spot where we were looking at the flow paths and we ask where did all of those flow paths start, we can see that over 60% of those flow paths started in agriculture, about 20 some percent started in forest, a little bit over 10% started in grass, pasture, and hay. And so now we've kind of got a sense of the model. We wanted to be able to provide county conservationists with a tool on how they might talk about this with people who are concerned about groundwater. Next slide. And so we came up with what we called the groundwater flow, Central Sands groundwater tracker. And we'll see we're doing that thing where we're going to try to do it live. And so we should be bringing that up. It looks like you might need to reload. The servers kicked you back out. Or maybe it's going to restart. So all of the data that we developed, I put it's all available in GIS, but when I talked to the counties in this area, I asked them, there we go. I asked them, I can give you the GIS, and then we had also just done an earlier version of this app, and I asked them, which do you want? And they were pretty unanimous with, I want the app. I don't want to deal with a GIS department. I don't want to have to work around stuff. This can work on a phone, it can work on a tablet, it can work on a computer. So we've got 4 tabs for the app. The first one is a purpose and disclaimer. And the purpose is it's an educational tool to identify contributing areas for groundwater in a given area, understand how long groundwater takes. You saw that importance again in Dan's talk previous, and identify the land cover. And then we have some questions how to use other things. Let's switch over and look at model assumptions. That's okay. Yeah, let's look at model assumptions. We wanted to be very clear about what this app can and can't do. It's steady state, aquifer porosity, all sorts of things, and it's only a 2D representation. We could do a 3D, but we were running out of time and we weren't sure that was so super important. Let's go and look at the last tab then too, all the way to the right. And then here's some additional resources documenting where the data came from that goes into the app, documenting the software and how we did the land cover. All right, so let's look at the map, interactive map, and see how people might use the app. Yeah, so you can see the outline of the study area. That's our groundwater flow model area. Also in the upper right, you can see we can put different base maps under there. And we can also show the pumping wells in the model, and we can also show, and there's a lot of pumping wells. If we zoom in, let's turn those back off, and let's also turn on the flow paths too. And so it's the generalized flow paths. If we showed them all, you can't really see how things are moving. So you can see there's a groundwater divide through the center of the model. Let's turn off the flow paths again. And maybe turn on terrain. I like the terrain for this. And then let's zoom in to some area wherever you would like. And yeah, go ahead and click right here. Yeah, let's say we're in the town of Plainfield and we want to know what's going on with my private well. I may have a private well there. And so let's zoom out just a touch so we get all of the flow paths. Other way. Yeah, they're perfect. And so we can see the orange dots are where the groundwater recharges in those flow paths. You can see the groundwater flow direction is to the creek here, to the stream here. What this thing does is it grabs all the flow paths within a couple hundred yards from the where you click. And then what it does is it grabs the land cover at the recharge area. And so you can see that most of the flow paths in the next one over are in forest. There's some grassland and some urban developed. And so I would not expect a lot of impacts from agriculture in a well in this part of Plainfield County. And then also kind of nice would be looking at transit times. So depending on where I'm at, I'm going to expect if there's some land use change, let's say all of a sudden somebody puts a CAFO or drops something with some maybe intense agriculture in this area, that change is probably not going to show up for decades. It's going to take a while from where the source is in these flow paths to where I'm asking the question. So I can also have that in my head. I shouldn't expect things to change overnight. Likewise, let's just go ahead and click on another area and then maybe we can maybe something to the right there. That would be great. And again, now you can see we're in an area with much more intensive agriculture with some grassland. And we also have much shorter travel times. So some of these areas, they're putting in solar farms, and we're expecting to see a change in groundwater, but we're hoping to monitor those changes in the next couple decades. So that's the app. I think we're probably to the end of the presentation, and there's some thank yous to folks. We had good input from Portage County and UW Stevens Point were very helpful. Okay. That's it.
Okay, thank you so much for walking us through that tool. It's really great to see how all that complex science can be translated into an interactive and accessible format for decision making. I did have one question for you, which is like you are translating fairly complex, or at least what to me seems like complex
Yeah.
groundwater modeling into the tool. So what have you found is been most important? And you mentioned, how that needs to be accessible and
Yeah.
intuitive to non-technical audiences. So what have you found is most important in achieving that?
Yeah. So you notice that it was password protected. We have some concerns that if this were just to go out into the wild, that it would be widely misinterpreted. And so what we've done is put on little training sessions for the counties to kind of walk them through it, not in 5 minutes or 10 minutes like here, but to kind of walk them through a little bit more carefully what the model can and can't do and what you should and shouldn't use it for. And this is mostly for county conservation departments. This is not for a general broad audience. And so that's why we've put the password protection on there. And that's why we've been doing the training. And so far, it's still, it's not in beta, but what we're doing now is the counties are using it for about another month. And then what we'll do is we'll go through an evaluation with them and make sure that ask them how they used it, what are some examples. We have some of that, but we want to expand that. And then we'll see where we take it from there. If there's things we need to include, or if no one's using the app, we'll create a data report and release the GIS data for a longer term.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thanks again to all of our speakers in that session, Dan, Dave, and Dan. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us and thinking about groundwater is extremely important to our region. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. We did have a packed agenda today. We're a couple minutes over, so we really appreciate all of you staying with us. Today's workshop was recorded, and so we encourage you to go listen to any parts of that you missed and share it with a friend. I know your time is valuable, and it's been a really busy month. And so once processing is complete, we will send out the recording and also the workshop materials on our Shared Water, Shared Futures website, which is linked to here. We also do have a planning framework that we've developed based on our preparation for this workshop to share with you there as well. We also encourage you to join us for our upcoming events. We've got lots of great things coming up, starting in a couple of weeks. As Kate mentioned at the start of the workshop, as part of CMAP's Catalyst series, we're really excited about the Great Lakes High Stakes event, which is part of Current's Water Week. I heard a rumor that you do get free lunch and a free zoo pass if you register for that. So please do go to Current Water Weeks. You can Google it and register for that event. And then as part of this workshop series, the Shared Water, Shared Future, we do have 3 remaining workshops. We did get some questions about groundwater modeling and drought, and that is actually the topic of our next workshop coming up on June 3rd. And then we'll follow that with a well impact review process on September 10th, and we'll be closing out the workshop series on November 12th with arguably one of the most important topics, which is understanding water governance and management in Illinois. Next slide. So we thank you again for joining us. We also thank our funder, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, Office of Water Resources. Thank you again to Wei Han for joining us today. And that concludes today's presentation.
Thank you.